It was incompetence and negligence on a grand scale. Every level, from Bank of England through Singapore International Monetary Exchange, it was like the Wild West. At Barings, you could pretty much do what you wanted, and that's what I did. In Japan, in Singapore, I could manipulate the markets in both locations. Nobody could trade with me because they were losing money.
You were a superstar.
Yeah. At the age of 25, I was flying high. Everybody was buying into the success story. Wherever you looked, everything was based around this lie that only I knew. We made an error. You know what you're supposed to do. The first thing you've got to do is to tell people about it. That's not what I did. I very stupidly decided to put that into the 5/8 account, my illegal account to warehouse the illegal positions that I was running. There were losses being concealed already. So I expected a knock on the door every single minute of every single day.
Something that started off with a $10,000 loss turned into a $1 billion loss.
Yep.
And the end of Barings Bank.
Yep.
Barings faces bankruptcy after
a rogue trader in Singapore
loses £400 million.
I was in the shit. At the age of 28, I was starting a 6.5-year prison sentence in Singapore. It did lead me to appraise who I was and come to the conclusion that I didn't particularly like the person that I'd become. Just being able to communicate, I think, is the most important thing that a human being can do. You will make mistakes. Just ask for help. Rather than being that 25-year-old Nick Leeson who thought that he could deal with everything, because I couldn't. Because I tell you, it will make your life easier.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... Imagine what it would be like if you lost $1 billion and caused the downfall of one of Britain's oldest banks. Well, that's exactly what my guest today did. His name is Nick Leeson, and if you were around in the 1990s, this man was infamous. His picture was on the page of every newspaper, and he caused a major financial crisis by his rogue trading. He was in Singapore, he was trading futures and derivative contracts, much like I did when I was in New York City, except he got out of hand. He had a small loss that turned into a bigger loss, and for 3 years, he was lying, trying to get the money back, and his whole life turned into a shambles until it all came crashing down, and he went on the lam. He went traveling around Asia, hiding from the police. He was finally captured in Germany, and he spent 4.5 years in a Singapore prison. He was divorced, he got cancer, and he lived to tell the tale. These days, funny enough, he actually goes back into those same banks, into the boardrooms, and advises them on risk management, on human controls to make sure this kind of thing never happens again. I love sitting down with Nick because it brought back old memories of me trading derivatives in New York City, and how a lot of times nobody is watching these traders, and how we continue to see these billion-dollar losses racked up by rogue traders around the world. I'm telling you, whether you like finance or not, you're going to love the story of Mr. Nick Leeson. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Nick Leeson, better known as the Rogue Trader, who was made famous for causing the fall of Barings Bank in 1995, arguably the biggest financial scandal of the 20th century. After losing an estimated £826 million trading derivatives and causing the bankruptcy of Barings Bank, you were sentenced to 6.5 years in a Singapore prison. During this time, you wrote your autobiography, or you started writing, Rogue Trader, which was made into a movie starring Ewan McGregor. Today, you spend your time advising major financial institutions around the world, ensuring they learn from your mistakes and maintain the correct compliance, control, and transparency. Nick, welcome to London Real.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great having you here. Before we get started, what's it like being in London? Does this city mean a lot to you? Did you start off your trading career here before you moved out to Singapore? I know you're from Watford originally, not far from here. What's the city mean?
Yeah, so I grew up in Watford, and my first job was in 15 Lombard Street for Coutts and Company, the Queen's Bank, so right in the heart of the city. So it's always a little bit weird when you come back to the city of London, but in the last 25 years, it's changed a lot. It's gone from, you know, bank out to Canary Wharf, and there's little bits and pieces of it coming back. So it's quite fragmented now, but I suppose the first few times it's very weird. You see people looking at you a little bit strangely, and most of the financial institutions that I worked for aren't there anymore. I think 15 Lombard Street is a pret-a-manger now, and you know, I worked at the Commercial Union building by Lloyd's of London for Morgan Stanley, and Barings, obviously, I put paid to that, unfortunately.
Right. All right. And when you were at Watford, did you always want to grow up to be a banker?
No. It would never crossed my mind. It was, you know, I always wanted to be a football player or something a little bit more sporty. I suppose sports were the things that really focused my mind during that period. I was quite good at school, did quite well in my exams, and but never really had a clear process of where I was going to be or what sort of industry I wanted to work in. My mother was a very working class background. I grew up on a council estate in Watford, so it was a little bit rough. You know, not the. I went to a very good school. Probably wasn't the normal hunting ground for the school that I went to. It tended to have students from nicer suburbs, whereas I definitely didn't come from one of the nicer suburbs, but did well at school, and was always quite, you know, my mother always wanted me to do better than she did. Very working class type mentality, better job, more stable career and more money, and then, you know, maybe moving up that working class ladder up to middle class or whatever. That was the type of things that were ingrained in me from an early age. So being academic or doing well at school was an important focus for her. And I did up until a certain point, you know, probably until the age of about 15, when there were a few diversions coming into my life at that time. But, you know, I think probably, you know, right up until I applied to Coutts and Company, which was a bank I'd never heard of. There were only 7 or 8 in London at the time. I'd never really thought about going into a career in banking. I might have been focused on doing something in law. You know, banking would have been viewed at the time as a job for life, and that would have certainly satisfied what my mother would have wanted for me. So, you know, I started work at Coutts and Company. As I said, it was some people applied to Coutts from the school that I went to. I'd never heard of them before. I think there was probably 50 applications from our school, two interviews, and then one job that was offered, and that was to me. So
you must have been impressive and maybe good at math and.
Yeah, I wasn't bad. I spectacularly failed my maths A-level, so I always joke that banking was clearly the only career for me after that failure. But no, I was good at maths up until about the age of 18. I was doing my A-levels at the time. The teacher that was looking after the A-level got sick, so she was out of the school for about 18 months, which meant I just didn't go to classes. And that was probably where the disconnect happened. It was, you know, it was a bit more applied mathematics, and trying to then get myself back up to speed before the exams in a very short period of time didn't really work, and I failed.
What year did you start with Coutts?
So I started when I was 18.
Okay.
So I was born in 67, so 85.
85.
Yeah.
And you moved to Singapore with bearings in 90? No.
I'd say I went to Indonesia in 90.
Okay.
I went to Singapore in 92.
92. Okay.
So I was probably in Indonesia towards the middle of 1990.
Right.
Then went back to the UK for about a 9-10 month period, and then moved on to Singapore.
Okay. And like, just to give people a rough idea of what we're dealing with, around 25 years old, I think you made a 10 million pound bonus, and around 28 years old, you were in prison with Chinese triads.
Yeah, I think some of the I mean that's true. I think the 10 million bonus is a bit of a fallacy. I think my biggest bonus was £500,000.
Okay.
And yeah, so but in terms of the chronological order, at the age of 25, I was flying high. At the age of 28, I was starting a 6.5 year prison sentence in Singapore.
Wow. I think people forget how young you were. And I want to talk about some of the lessons in the entire process, because you processed all of that in prison, you wrote the book, and then these days you advise people about risk management. I wanted to just give a little bit of a lens, because I knew a bit about this world.
Yeah.
So I studied engineering at MIT, and I was recruited by Wall Street as one of the rocket scientists to come in and trade the derivatives,
right,
which is what you were trading out in Singapore. And so in 1993, I went to Bankers Trust at One Liberty Plaza right next to the World Trade Center, and I was given the interest rate swap book, which was a book where I traded a lot of the contracts that were traded in Chicago Mercantile Exchange in Singapore. I chiefly traded Eurodollar futures. You were trading more stock index futures, I think.
Yeah, Nikkei 225.
Yeah, Nikkei. So that was a very deep, volatile, that was a big instrument.
Yeah.
And so maybe to start off, just to give people a bit of an idea, I think a lot of people, when they hear the word derivative, they don't know what it is. It's probably got a bad reputation for good and bad reasons. Do you ever try to explain that word to people, what derivatives are?
I certainly don't think that they're as complex as I think the word derivatives gives out the idea that it's very complex and difficult to understand. It certainly wasn't. I mean, I was trading Nikkei 225 futures, which were 3, 6, or 9 month contracts, based on where you thought the future price of the Nikkei 225.
Right, which is a basket of 225 Japanese companies.
Yeah, 225
right.
Japanese.
So at one, and what would it trade at roughly back then as a number? Do you remember?
Well, it went up to as high as 39,900.
Okay.
I think that was just before I arrived in Singapore. By the time I left Singapore, it was trading at 18,000.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea of the volatility. It's lost over 50% of its value in that 3 year period. And I don't think Japan as a country has ever really recovered from that particular
Probably
period.
not. And so for people understanding, you could go out and say buy 225 companies in Japan and try to buy and sell those, or you could buy an index that tracks those stock prices, and all of those things say add up to 39,000, and then you can just use that as a number. And if you think the Japanese economy is going to do well, or the company's going to go up in value, you buy it.
Yeah.
If you think they're going to go down in value, you sell it. And then Nick was trading a future where it would settle 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now. So where do you think the Nikkei index will be in 9 months?
Exactly.
So like you said, actually derivatives can mean a lot of different things. I think it really means something that's derived from the price of something else.
Correct.
But actually most of them are quite simple. Some of them, like the stuff I was trading at Bankers Trust, could get very complex.
Yeah.
But the stuff you see traded on futures exchanges are actually quite simple.
Very simple, very simple.
Right.
So,
that being said, they were the newest, novelist instruments of the time, and the compliance departments were always, and maybe will always be, behind some of those things, because these traditional institutions were used to maybe some government bonds or some stocks, and otherwise they didn't really know how to necessarily value those or track the risk of those things.
yeah, I think up until that stage, everything was quite vanilla, quite ordinary. So people were quite okay with what was going on in the equity market. But now you're in a situation where you could put up a small amount of the overall value of the index and trade it quite. There was a lot of speculation in those particular markets. So You know, when it came to audit and compliance and risk management, it was the new kid on the block. There was a premium paid for people who worked in that area, as much as there was a premium paid for the people who worked in settlements of derivatives as well, because, you know, it was something slightly different, and there were a smaller number of people that were experienced in it, and that's why the premium got paid.
Yeah, and I experienced the same thing at Bankers Trust. So I was on a desk with about 20 guys, and a lot of our books were still being run on Excel spreadsheets that we would run overnight by ticking, you know, a basis point change of every single, you know, interest rate, you know, derivative instrument, and then it would price it. And if it crashed overnight, you wouldn't have a P&L, you wouldn't have anything. And it also meant that, you know, compliance didn't always have the best handle on what was going on, although they were paid better than most because they were the smarter ones. Yeah. And we were probably paid better than most as well because we were potentially making lots of money. But there was also a little bit of a disconnect from someone really watching over you. And I remember compliance coming over and saying, where do you want to mark your trades this month? And I would be like, mark them here. And they'd be like, okay. And they would leave. And that was my P&L that I would get paid on, and I was deciding what it was worth.
Yeah, I think if you look at it from the other perspective, it wasn't difficult to confuse them.
Right, correct.
So if you throw a couple of words in that they don't really understand, they'll nod their head and say, yeah, you know, everything's okay.
And I know you can be a pretty charming guy, and so I think all traders have had that talk with their compliance, where they throw a few words out there. They act a little busy. They say, this is this. Don't you know how this trades? And then they go away. You're paid more than them, and you're not their boss, but there is some intimidation that can go on. At least it used to go on back in the day. Yeah,
the more confident or the more sure of your answer, the more likely they are to believe you. And that still goes on to this day. I was at an audit conference a few weeks ago, and it was exactly the same thing. You know, from an audit perspective, what they're trying to look out for is somebody who's too confident about their answers, because, you know, the belief is that they're trying to divert you away from what you know, you're very correct in terms of your answers and very sure of them, and for that reason there's an inclination to believe what you're being told. And that was a lot of what went on during that period.
Right, and I want to get into the details of what happened with you, but this will always be a dilemma, and I think it's important that people understand this, because, you know, these institutions look to the hot new products because that's where the margins are. Those products, you need smart people to trade them. You have to pay them a premium, and then usually only they understand them or the nuances of them, and you have to trust them so they can trade them, but at the same point you have to look after them, and the gamekeepers and the poachers, you know, it's hard to say who's looking after who, and like you said, I'm sure you see this played out even today.
Yeah, you've got a board of directors or a risk manager who has no real direct experience of the product or the new kid that's being traded, and therefore they don't ask the right questions. And what you tend to find as well is a lot of people don't want to ask a question which might suggest that they don't understand, which makes that dilemma double-ended, if you like.
Yeah, and these hotshot traders are sometimes being paid millions of dollars. And I was about to make an analogy like a prison, but I don't know if this is the best analogy. But if you're in prison and you're watching every day, all day, the guards and the way things work, you're going to start to notice little indiscrepancies that maybe could be exploited. And I'd say when you trade a book, just by nature of trading the book, you would realize, oh, that wasn't noticed, or that got noticed, or I can do this and this can do this. And pretty soon you see ways where profits and losses can go places.
Exactly, and I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's where it gets really, really dangerous, you know, and that's why those control functions have to be as robust and effective as they possibly can. So if there is a gap, it only exists for a short period of time, and people are very quickly put back into line. You know, if there is an opportunity, it's a very small percentage of people that will seek to exploit it, but there is somebody in your organisation who will seek to exploit it. So you've got to make sure that there are no gaps and that everything is monitored correctly.
Yeah, and as long as there's so much money on the line and people are being paid for performance, there will be someone that does it. And as we hopefully we'll find out today with Nick, they're not necessarily all sociopaths and serial killers. They're just people in certain places at certain times that made certain decisions. And maybe we talk about that as well.
Sure.
So, so I was in a slightly different but similar organization. And so just to go through where you're at, so you are kind of mid-20s, you're kind of becoming, I guess, more of a hotshot at Barings, which is why they sent you out to Singapore.
Yeah, I was quite pushy as well.
Okay. Explain, what was that young Nick Leeson like? You know, what especially once you got your feet in the banking industry?
Well, I was determined.
Okay.
I wanted to get to the top. Everything was about success.
Money, power, success?
No, not money.
Really?
Not power to a certain extent. It was that stature that you were looking for. I would always measure myself against other people in the organisation and try to achieve more than they did. So I was very much focused in terms of getting to the top or close to the top within the organisation. So it was all about success for me. And working in Asia, what you realised fairly early when you're in Asia is that you're a big fish in a small pond rather than the other way round if you're back in London. Right. So I enjoyed Asia as well. You know, there were certain attributes to a life in Asia as well at that time. But
such as?
Well, I mean,
fun.
Swimming pools, heat, fun, yeah, all of it. It's,
parties.
Yeah. Okay. And again, it's. All of it was good. We were very well looked after. The banks were very good too. I worked in Japan for Morgan Stanley as well. So whichever bank it was, you were always very well looked after.
Expats were treated well, paid well, housing paid for.
It was, but I actually went to Singapore more for the opportunity of what it was going to present to me. So I think it's a bit that's, quite often overlooked, but I took a pay cut to move to Singapore. So I wasn't on this, huge expat salary when I went there. I had to find my own accommodation. I didn't live in the more renowned expat areas. I lived out at Bukit Timah, which was out by the racecourse. It was in a small complex. There was a pool. So, still there were advantages over living back home in Watford, where there are very few swimming pools. But, it wasn't quite the expat lifestyle. But the opportunity that it afforded me in terms of getting onto the trading floor, moving up that, running an operation on my own and adding to the development that I'd already had or the success that I already had, that was what drove me to take that opportunity.
Okay. And so like you said, now you're kind of the big fish in the little pond. No one in London's really watching you very well, right? It's kind of hard to watch. There's a time difference, getting on phone calls. There was probably no video conferencing back then.
No.
And walk us through what happened in Singapore. What was those first couple of years like?
Well, it went wrong fairly quickly. Okay. To be fair, when I was in Singapore, I think I arrived in Singapore in April of '92. I'd say by September of '92, there were losses being concealed already. So it was a fairly quick process from when I arrived, but all of the setup was mine. So there was a guy who ran the operation side in Singapore who did have some input in terms of people that were employed. But it was a classic error. The people that were employed had no previous experience, so they very much became moulded by what I needed them to do. So, the movie suggests that there was a certain amount of collusion. That's definitely not the case. The people were just naive. And the people that did have some previous experience, the order fillers who worked on the trading floor, they never went back to the office. They were well remunerated. They were never admonished. They were never told off. So they were living, the perfect life. They were picking up a fat paycheck at the end of the month and really didn't get any grief from me. And there are lots of things that went wrong. I mean, it was a complete systemic breakdown of every level. Me not having the necessary management experience during that time to really run the operation, settlements not working, treasury not working, the board of directors not really working, the asset liability committee not working, risk management, compliance, nothing really worked. But I think the distance from the centre, as you mentioned at the beginning, was one of the key reasons for that. But people did come and visit, but it was, Singapore at the time was a bit of a party town, and they came in, and I'm sure that they're part of the reason for coming, or that was written on the piece of paper, was that they were going to investigate something. But there was a certain amount of enjoyment that was on the agenda as well. So it was easy to divert people and keep them away from the scrutinisation of what was going on, and that's what I did. during that period. You know, if somebody visited and they were specifically going to look at the trading floor or the margin that I had in Singapore, it was, you know, there would be a very superficial look at that in a very short period of time, and then, you know, I'd be making sure that they weren't on the trading floor for the rest of the visit that they were there, and I'd take them to the airport and say goodbye to them.
All right, so you were already trying to minimize the time and exposure they had to your operation because you were concerned they might find something.
Well, there's plenty to see. You know, every piece of paper had the 5/8 account on it. You know, it's not, you know, it's always described as a hidden account. It was anything but hidden. You couldn't hide it because the volume of trading that was going through the 5/8 account by the end of the period was probably 90% of the daily volume that Barings were transacting.
Okay.
You know, it grew to that sort of...
and what is the 5/8 account for people that don't know?
The 5/8 account was the illegal account that... it started off as an error account, and then it became my illegal account to, or my account to warehouse the illegal positions that I was running.
Okay.
So very early on in the mid of '92, what happened, just to give you the correct chronological order, is the Japanese markets were collapsing aggressively. So there was lots of spoofing, lots of layering, all of which is illegal these days.
What is a spoof or a layer? So
people putting orders into the market and then cancelling them, or adding to. So layering is where you just layer on top of the orders. So it just gives the perception that it's very, you know, it's very heavy on the sell side or very heavy on the buy side, whichever way it is. The markets in Japan were automated, so you could see this on the screens. And if the Nikkei 225 moved 700 points, the circuit breakers would kick in and there would be no trading for that day. So if people continue to layer on top, you know, every half an hour, I can't remember exactly the amount of time, but every half an hour, the market would tick down 100 points. And so if you took your orders out, all of a sudden it would open. And so that's the idea of spoofing or layering, and it still happens to this day, but not to, I think there's a lot more scrutiny over it than there was back in the day.
So a lot of people gaming that.
Yeah, but the way that it was gained in Singapore at the time, or in Japan at the time, was that you could manufacture it so that the market didn't open in Japan. So it would go sell, the sell orders would mean that the market would go down 700 points and then it wouldn't open for the day. And then all of the business shifted to Singapore. So Singapore went from trading 2,000 contracts a day as a fairly new product to trading 20 to 30,000 contracts a day, because all of the volume shifted from Japan over to Singapore. So you know, the systems weren't able to cope with it. So, you know, in an open outcry market, you're trying to match the two orders in a 30-minute period. It was taking us 14, 15 hours to match a trade. The systems would break down, you wouldn't be able to access them for 5 or 6 hours. So sometimes it would be 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning before you could match a trade, which obviously gives you a lot of risk. We're all looking for new staff, so you'd try and recruit from the other brokers. The other brokers will pay them a little bit more because they know who's good. So eventually, and it's quite a small community in Singapore.
How big?
The trading floor has, you know, maybe 400 people on it, I'd say. And some of those are the clerks who are doing the running around. So you'd know yourself from the 90s, you know, if you were running a book, or you're running a desk, or you're running an operation within the bank, you know, maybe an auditor comes in to audit you, and they're particularly good, they appear quite clever, intellectual, you recruit them. And the same thing happened in Singapore. So we were looking at other brokers to try and take their staff. Couldn't really do too much of that. So then you're looking at some of the local order fillers, and then you look at the exchange officials. So a lot of the exchange officials are taken off of the trading floor, those control functions, and are working for brokers. So then all of a sudden, the control that the exchange has over the pit is non-existent. There's trading outside of the pit, there's fights, there's all sorts of stuff going on.
Physical fights.
Yeah, it was like the Wild West, right? Because the guys that they then brought in to control the trading floor had no experience, because it's almost cannibalistic. You're eating or you're gorging on the people that are already working there, and all of a sudden there's nothing left. So it did. You could pretty much do what you wanted, and I did for a period of time. You know, that wasn't the intent. I mean, we spoke a bit about at the beginning people seeing opportunity. That wasn't the way that it worked for me. You know, we made an error, and I very stupidly decided to put that into the 5/8 account.
Now, how does an error happen, and what is the typical course of your day? Are you getting an order in from a client that says to buy or sell some Nikkei futures, and you're doing it? And then what is this? How does an error happen? Just
well, I mean, there's lots of different ways. I mean, you'll get, usually our orders came through the desk in Tokyo, so there was a sales desk in Tokyo who'd be speaking to the clients. So we had no direct client conversations. The order would come down the Squawk box, or it would come over the phone, depending on how busy it was at that time.
Right, and so people know a Squawk box is this kind of open speaker
Yeah.
where people yell down it all day. I know this all sounds insane if you've never been on a trading
Yeah.
floor, but I used to have, even when I was a broker in London, I'd have Squawk boxes from 10 different clients,
Yeah.
and they would all shout down at me during the day, sometimes very colorful names, like, pick up the phone, you cunt, right? You know what I'm saying, right? Or yeah, or buy 100 of this, or where is it? And there's actually some people's jobs all day, maybe you have one on your exchange, that just quote the market over Squawk boxes all day long. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of this audio communication going on.
Yeah, there was a lot of audio communication, but ours was directly back to the trading, or well, to two. So there was the trading desk in Tokyo who were taking proprietary positions, and then there was the sales desk who were passing orders through from a number of clients that would have been trading the Nikkei 225. So then the signal has to go into the pit. So you have guys who are executing the orders in the pit. And so we'd have 3 or 4 of those in the pit. So it would be a hand signal to say what you wanted to do. So maybe 7 bid on 100.
Still got it, Nick.
Well, it's difficult. It's difficult to forget.
Right,
it's not, and again, it's not that difficult, right? It might look a little bit funny, but it's,
So,
you know, it's not.
So what Nick's doing is when your hands are facing you, you're buying. When
Yeah.
your hands are facing out, you're selling.
Exactly.
And this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
Yeah.
6, 7, 8, 9,
That's it.
10, I think, right?
10 is on your head.
Or 10's on your head, right?
Yeah,
10.
so just 10, and then
10.
that's 100.
Okay, it's 100. All right. So you're going 7 bid for a certain number of contracts, and then do you say who you are? Do you say your
No,
bearings?
you're looking at your own order filler who's
Right,
in the
okay.
pit. So he takes the order. He'll then execute the order, write his ticket out, and the ticket will come back.
Right, and so people know usually there's a pit, and then in Chicago or New York or various places, it's a bunch of locals usually that are looking in, talking to each other, and that's where the inside price. And a lot of times there's someone on the outside that are listening, that are facing the people on the phones, depending on the size of the exchange.
Yeah. So our brokers would be back to back.
Right.
So there'd be a guy that was communicating that back personally to him, and there might be we would usually have a third one on the side who'd always be giving the market back, so the people on the phone can see that.
Right,
as
and
well.
so and how would you show the market? You were just doing it there.
Yeah,
So it'd be like 2, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3.
Yeah.
So doing this the
just
whole time.
constantly like that.
So that means a bid offers where you can buy them and where you can sell them, and then when it goes
Exactly.
up, it's 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4, and they're doing this all day long.
All day long. All day long. So some
Back
of the
in the good old days, Nick.
Exactly.
Right,
yeah.
okay.
So
Now it's all on a computer.
Now it's all
and
on
they're
a
all
computer.
gone.
Yeah. All the skills gone.
Right. Okay.
I am joking. But
But these allowed you to get the inside and the human touch. You could really feel more of where the market was, right? And you could get the edge, right?
Well, I mean, the edge for me at the time was that the lead market, if both markets were open, the lead market is Japan.
Right.
So the guys in Singapore are trading off a screen, and they can see the market moving in Japan. So they, you know, everything was very much led by what was going on in Japan. When that changed was when there was when the circuit breakers came in, and everything. Singapore became the prime market,
Right.
which meant that there was a lot more edge, and you'd do things. Again, going back to the spoofing and layering context, if you see somebody offer 1,000. You know, people are naturally going to try. Somebody who's trying to get out of their market or get out of their position is going to lower their offer. So they're going to start to chase that bid lower. Yeah. And one of the other classic ones was you could try to trigger stops. So if there was, if somebody had a stop above the market to limit their loss, you could buy one and it might trigger, and then they have to execute the order. And in doing so, you could push the market a few. So there were a few things like that, which, from an investor's perspective, aren't ideal.
Right.
But in terms of what went on the market, were fair game at the time. And I presume to this day still are. I mean, if you get a futures market that's touching a new high, the most simple thing to do is to buy one at the next price and see what happens.
Yeah, because it triggers people having to take their losses.
Yeah.
You can make gains on them taking their losses. So
Yeah.
there's front running, like you said. If you know there's a big order coming in to sell, you can sell ahead of it and try to make money on them having to panic a bit. So these are kind of old school kind of trading strategies.
Very much so. And then you get you get periods around crashes or wars where the opening bid and offer can really go anywhere. And there were some episodes many years ago, and we're not going to mention names, but there were, a lot of brokers in Chicago and in other locations who, around the crash back in '87 and other periods, there would have been no bid in the pit. So the market might have closed at 7,000 the day before, and the Dow, and these numbers I'm just throwing out, I don't know what they were, but the Dow could have closed, or it wouldn't have been the Dow, but it would have been one of the other markets might have closed at 7,000 the previous day. But then there's, because of what's gone on in the New York markets, there's no bid in Japan, and so people are you've got lots of sell orders, they sell on the open, so they've got to be executed on the open, and it just pushes the bid lower and lower and lower, and several people became multi-millionaires overnight on that basis, because they were the people who bought at the low, and over the course of the day it's probably back up trading at 6,000.
Right, they would throw a low bid in there. It would have to get filled.
Yeah.
You say low bid, but no one else was putting a bid in there.
You've got to hit the bid.
Yeah, it was a bit, and to give people who don't know these markets, it was a bit like trying to sell a house in Las Vegas in 2008,
right,
where you said, well, everyone tells you your house is worth $150,000, but if you have to sell it today, nobody will buy it. So guess what that house is worth today? $0 or $1,000 if someone wants the furniture. And that's what these markets are like. When they're going down, there's literally no price, and it can force all sorts of weirdness going on, and people can make a lot of money.
Yeah. Look, if you've got a market on open order, it has to be executed at the opening price. There's no room for movement on that, and the client will hold you to that opening price. So if the opening price is 1,000 and it closes at 6,000, you've done your job. And it doesn't happen often, but in those days of really huge movements or something really negative happening around the markets, it can happen. I'm sure Q8 was another one, when and any time there's a huge
the first Desert Storm.
Anything like that. Those sort of days would have been.
Okay. So just quickly back to the error. So you had an error on a trade, and based on that, you created this 5/8 account.
Well, the 5/8 account existed prior to that, but this was the occasion that I stepped over the mark. And what it was, as I mentioned to you a little while ago, there were very few people that working in our operation at the time. Then this huge upsurge in volume that we weren't ready for, the exchange wasn't ready for. So you're rapidly trying to recruit people. We took a couple of girls who were just the runners for a couple of the local order fillers. One of those picked up the phone, executed the order the wrong way, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning that I realised that we had an error, because I went back and I used to tick off every single trade. I was very accurate and diligent in everything that I did, and probably was for a little bit of a period after that, until it really came on top. So that first error was.
So she
was
bought instead of sold.
Yeah.
And it was like how many contracts?
I think the loss, because the markets were moving, so the loss total on the day was about $10,000.
$10,000. Okay. Gotcha. And so again, bought instead of sold, so you'd have to go in the next day and kind of reverse that position, kind of double of what she was supposed to do to get the client back their trade.
Well, but okay, and you know what the process is, you know what you're supposed to do. The first thing you've got to do is to tell people about it. So, and I knew that. I knew that it shouldn't be run, the position shouldn't be run. I think everybody from day one working anywhere near any trading operation, if you make an error, you cut it, and you don't think twice about it. You go through that. Now, sometimes it is more difficult than that, but that's the way that you're told that it happens. So the next morning I went into the head of operations. I told him. He didn't really know too much about futures and options. He didn't. He was more involved in the equity side of business, although he did have an overview role for what we were doing in Singapore. He told me to refer it to London. London didn't open for another 5 or 6 hours, and I took the chance that in that intervening period, I was going to be able to close it with no loss, and nobody would be any the wiser.
Right. So something that started off with a $10,000 loss turned into a $1 billion loss.
Yep.
And the end of Barings Bank.
Yep.
And that's a great lesson for anyone to learn, whether you're a trader or not a trader.
Yeah.
Because it's such an inhuman thing to cut losses.
Oh, absolutely.
But when you come on the trading floor day one, they try to teach you that, I mean, as Gordon Gekko said in the movie Wall Street, never get emotional about stock, you know? Yeah. And people say as a trader, you're supposed to buy low and sell high. But the natural human instinct is to do the opposite, right? When you take a loss, you want to try to trade your way out of it.
Yeah.
And when you get a gain, your natural instinct is to maybe just take the money and run, you know? Yeah. And so you were thinking, I'm going to just hope the market goes my way and close out the position and we're going to be okay. Because you had a 50% chance maybe of that happening.
Absolutely. And it wasn't too far away.
Right.
You know, it got further away during the course of the day, and in which case I'm more complicit in what's happened. I don't want any attention focused on my operation and anybody looking at it and me coming in under... not scrutiny, but it was, I didn't want anything negative, you know. The more, I'm only looking for things that are positive in terms of the way that I'm advancing within the organisation. And, you know, I often get asked, you know, why did I do it at that time? And again, there's no excuses. You always know that you shouldn't be doing it. You continue, and therefore you have to accept responsibility for it. But at Barings, where the controls were very weak. It wasn't a case of seeking out those weak controls, but I saw so many people put trades into an error account and run it for an hour, a day, a couple of days. Sometimes it would be a salesman in Tokyo, sometimes it would be one of the traders, and it'd get warehoused. And it was just a common thing. So, you know, and one of the things I try to tell businesses when I speak to them is that people are very influenced by what they see and what they hear. So if you see something happening, there's a far bigger chance of that person then doing the same sort of thing, which is what happened in my situation. It wasn't such a big deal to put this into the 5/8 account on one occasion. The problem is that I did it repeatedly over a period. And so what I often say to people is when a behavior is wrong, it's always wrong. You know, there's no justification. You can't make a justification for a wrong behavior being right, even if it makes money.
Right. And that was the culture. So you're really talking about a company culture of people using that error account. And you saw it and then you used it. And so again, just to clarify for people, normally in the course of a day, you would take an order from a salesperson in Tokyo, you would execute and pass that risk on to the client.
Yeah.
Barings wouldn't typically have a proprietary trading account where you would say punt and take positions yourself.
Against the client? No.
No. Or even for your own bound, you wouldn't necessarily...
Oh, no, we did. Yeah, Barings did.
They did sometimes. But your job wasn't to do that.
No.
So when you had a position, it went into this error account because technically you weren't supposed to be trading these futures on your own behalf.
Right.
And now this account, the 5/8, why was it called that account? And maybe tell us a bit about that account.
Well, it's quite a simple story. The number 8 is perceived to be lucky in the Asian culture. And so, you know, we needed a bit of luck, and 5/8 seemed like a good idea, and there's no real logic to it other than that. I have been told subsequently in events in Hong Kong and places like that that 5/8 swaps it around, becomes unlucky. I don't know. I'm not a great believer in any of this sort of stuff, but that was the reason. It was, one of the locals told me that 8 was a lucky number, so it became the 5/8 account.
Okay, so that day started off with about $10,000 down. How did this proceed, and what happened next?
I can't give you the exact numbers.
Okay.
But,
were you trying to protect this employee as well?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
They would have been fired. She would have been sacked.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely in my background. Working class. That loyalty is an important thing for me, and always has been, and still is today. I'd hate to put myself back into one of those dilemmas. In 2019 or 2020, because. I'd like to think I've matured to the level where you would, you know, you'd castigate or admonish or put their head on the chopping block. But I'm not really that type. I'm not that callous or I don't know what word I would use for it, but I'm not really that person.
And this is exactly what a young runner will do. They'll make a mistake like that. I mean, I'm guessing.
I mean, she left. She left a couple of days later.
Okay.
You know, because she couldn't put up with the pressure
right.
of the role, and because all of this volume was moving into Singapore, it was, you know, it was a real stressful period, and it was relentless. You know, the circuit breakers would be in on a Monday, on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, and so all of this volume was kicking through, and it was just a very testing time.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.